Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Marc Matthews, and if you're not familiar with Marc, Marc is a producer and engineer who runs a website called Synth Music Mastering, which, as you can guess, focuses on mastering synth-based music. And Marc is an amazingly talented engineer, and we don't really talk too much about synth stuff on this podcast, but I thought it would be really helpful to bring someone on who's familiar with that world, who does a lot of it, to talk about some of the challenges of mastering music in that genre. And in addition to running that website, Marc also hosts an amazing podcast called Inside the Mix. And I was actually very fortunate to be on episode number 102 of his podcast. So if you're interested in learning my perspective on mastering, that's what we cover inside of that episode there. But in today's episode here, we talk a lot about the various aspects that go into making professional sounding masters. And we get into the dark art of mastering and uncovering what that really means. We also get into some really great tips all about how to make sure your mixes have enough low end in them. And if you're working on systems that are maybe a little bit low end challenged, what tools can you use to make the right decisions and feel a lot more confident in what's actually happening inside your mix? So yeah, we talk about that. We talk about AI mastering. We talk about a whole bunch of other great stuff. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Marc Matthews, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
I'm well, Mike. Thanks for inviting me on. And I say I'm well. I'm at the tail end of the flu, so if I do cough at any point, I will move away from the microphone.
It's all good, man. We'll edit those things out. But for people who might not be familiar with you and what you do, who you are, how you got into all this stuff, can you give us that background story on how you got here?
Yeah, of course. So so Marc Matthews. So I'm the owner, proprietor, I guess you could call it, of Synth Music Mastering. So offering mastering services mainly in the synth realms, as it were, so like synth pop, synth wave, retro wave, that sort of stuff. And also run the Inside the Mix podcast. So you kindly joined me on the Inside the Mix. I think
it's a great podcast, man. Thank you for having me on there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. So the latter part of last year. Mastering engineer, mix engineer, podcaster, doing that as well, coaching as well. And all before that, I'm a guitarist as well and a producer, so I released my own music. And yeah, it all started many, many years ago. So, I mean, I went down the whole academic route, doing the degree level stuff. So I went forward and got a master's degree as well in music engineering and production. And it all stemmed really from me playing guitar. So I picked up the guitar probably when I was about 13, 14. Didn't tune it for the first 2 or 3 years, trying to play. I mean, this was around the time of what was I into? Like new metal, so it's like Papa Roach and Limp Bizkit, Linkin Park less so, but bands like that, POD, all these sort of bands, trying to play their songs, then realized I had to tune it, and then sort of jumping forward, joining bands as well. And then it wasn't until I went into the studio and we were recording an EP, if I remember rightly, and I was just watching the engineer, and I was like, actually, obviously being on the other side of the glass recording, I was kind of like, I'm interested in what you're doing. Like, how are you doing that? How are you manipulating that sound that's coming out of the speakers? Because I'm really interested in that. And how do you do that? And that led me down the path of sort of education. So then I did this evening school thing with regards to music production, which then led me on to doing a degree, and then led me on to doing the master's degree. And all the while, still in the band, gigging, touring, releasing albums and stuff. And also getting experience in various different studios over here in the UK, namely mastering studios, really, because that's where I was really interested in mastering in particular, which kind of leads me to where I am now. But prior to that, it was I was getting that mixing experience, being in the band and working with these different producers and engineers and just watching what they're doing. And that sort of led me to down that academic route, still in the band. And then it got to the point where I was like, you know what, I'm in this metal band and I loved it. I had a fantastic time being in a band, you're like touring, gigging. You're out, basically being in a band is like being with your best mates, and then you're out. Sometimes you get paid. I mean, we never got to that sort of level whereby we did really. I mean, it wasn't until we went into the continent and played in Europe that we really got paid. And that was only like a few hundred quid. But then I sort of jacked that in because I really wanted to concentrate on the production side of things, in particular, like mastering. But all the while still releasing my own music. And then I realized, actually, I quite like synth-based music. I always had done. And doing the Inside the Mix podcast and chatting to other sort of synth producers right when I started the podcast, I quickly realized that there's quite a large number of producers who've moved over from sort of metal alternative music into synth music. And it must be because of the sonic sounds, the soundscape of synths and the way you can manipulate them and create any sounds you want, basically. That's what I really love about synthesis and sampling. You can create what you want. And that led me to then releasing my own music as a producer. And then I still do that now. I released an EP at the latter part of last year, and that took me ages to do because I primarily now really focus on working on other people's music in the synth realm, notably with mastering, do a bit of mixing as well. And the podcast. I mean, the podcast started, I think it's 3 years old now. I think it is 3 years old, actually, thinking about it. And that time has flown. And that has grown into something of itself. I mean, I didn't, much like you've got a podcast, you probably know, there's a lot more work that goes into it than you realize when you start.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And then what with AI, like over the last year, AI has made it a lot easier for me in terms of getting rid of those mundane activities, notably like social media content and stuff like that. So I've lent into that a lot. And it's a focus of the podcast at the moment as well. And that brings me up to where I am now. So yeah, Synth Music Mastering, offering mastering services, bespoke mastering services to synth producers, artists, mainly independent ones, to be honest. I work mainly with like independent sort of underground artists. But in that being said, I do other genres if like I think it's a good fit. And that sort of leads me to where I am now.
Cool, man. I love that. You talked about how you had that experience in the studio and that kind of changed things for you. And I think that a lot of people listening to this have experienced that same thing, right? It's like you're in the studio, all of a sudden you kind of get this like different perspective of like, oh yeah, that's another cool job in the music industry. And you get fascinated with it. And most people tend to like have that experience and immediately want to get into recording or mixing because like that was their experience. But you talked about how you had a fascination with mastering. What was it specifically when it came to mastering that appealed to you?
You're exactly right in what you say there with regards to mixing and recording, because that's what I started out doing. And I think it's important that, much with anything, when you're trying to find your direction, where you want to go, you need to experience all these other facets of music production. So it's good to do live sound, for example. I did a bit of live sound. I did a lot of recording, notably mainly when I was doing the academic stuff. And I also I do enjoy mixing because I mix my own stuff and I still mix other people's work if it's a good fit. But then I did mastering. So I had the opportunity to go into a mastering studio for 5 days when I was doing this I think it was my foundation degree. And it wasn't until then that I realized, actually, this is really what I want to do. The recording aspect of it, for me, I was kind of like, this is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. I'm not that I'm lazy, but I was just like, it's a lot of work. And I figure, if I'm going to do the recording side of things and have a recording studio, I need to be 100% invested in this. Otherwise, I don't want to do anything half-assed. I don't want to sell clients short. And I think you need to be really passionate as well. I mean, that's a cliche, passion, but it is true. So I tried out all these different options. And then it wasn't until I did mastering, I was like, you know what? I really like sitting and just listening to music in that sort of, it's a different way in mastering that you listen to music. You're picking it apart. You're listening to these subtle nuances and thinking, okay, well, the artist has got to where they've got here. How can I be a conduit for them to really push that music and get it to that point where it's ready for release? And just watching these engineers work and sit there and doing these little tweaks and minor sort of dB, half a dB changes, thinking, wow, that's amazing. Like just those subtle little changes are bringing it out. So that's what really led me into mastering. I mean, they say it's a dark art. I don't know if that's necessarily, I think once upon a time it may have been, but I think now in particular with the advent of AI and in particular with platforms like, or applications like Ozone, you can now reverse engineer what that mastering assistant is doing. It's becoming less of a dark art. And now you can see, okay, well, under the hood, that's what the mastering's doing. So I think it's making it a bit more accessible. But yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a ramble there. But basically what I'm saying is you want to kind of like try everything before you make your decision on what it is you want to do. And that's what I did. And that's how I came to mastering.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Like I have definitely, for myself, I've definitely been heading much more in the direction of focusing exclusively on mastering. Like I still do a lot of mixes, and I pretty much have eliminated all like full production gigs at this point. You know, for me, it's like I have the ability to pick and choose when I want to do a project, and if it's something that I think it's like really fun, I really believe in, then sure, I'll take a full production thing. But mastering is something that really appealed to me too, because like I just like the idea of, you know, taking something that someone has already done and just making it that much better, you know, like just these like little details that can go a long way. And it's funny that you bring up the idea of like mastering being a dark art. Like I kind of feel the same way as you, where like, I feel like for so long, so many people were just like keeping secrets about mastering. It's like mastering is actually really simple at the core of it all, you know, like you got your volume, EQ, some compression if you need it, and some limiting. Like it's pretty simple. I think really like the dark art of it is just like it's having trained ears to be able to get away with understanding how much impact you can make with like a half dB bump of something, you know. I think that's the stuff that is kind of magical to people to realize like, oh, wait a minute, like these small moves can make that big of a difference. Because like when you're getting started, like there's that tendency with EQ to just like go crazy, and sometimes there's a time and place for that too. But you know, I think mastering, our job isn't to radically transform the mix. It's just to like enhance it and make it a little bit sweeter, you know. And so for myself, I've definitely started to lean a little bit more to the mastering side of things, because I really enjoy it, and I also enjoy like being able to work on my own and not have to wait hours for people to get their performances right, you know?
100%. And I think having been in the studio and being that artist, like, I mean, I'm a guitarist. I wouldn't say that I'm like, did I put my 10,000 hours in guitar? Probably not. And I think that was reflected in the studio, and I could sense it from the engineer when he's just like, right, okay, well, we'll break it down and we'll comp the takes. And then it got to the point whereby we were comping these ridiculously short takes, and I was like, yeah, I probably should be in a slightly different musical remit right now than this. But hey ho, I had fun, you know. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. I think it was down to the engineer and not wanting to wait for people. I think that's what it is. Much like you could sit and be a mastering engineer, and you could just. I think you have to enjoy your own company as well, right? Like, because a lot of the time you're just doing it on your own, and you do have that feedback loop, as I'm sure you do. I do with the clients that I work with, and I'm bouncing ideas back and forth, but it's asynchronous. So a lot of the time, sometimes we'll jump on a call, but a lot of the time it's sort of like I'll send them a message and they shoot one back. But yeah, that's another thing I like about mastering as well. And you don't have to have these huge studios as well. You can have these nice kitted out rooms, and yeah. If it comes down to the financial side of things as well, if you are limited on space, maybe you need to consider, like, because I've known engineers, and this is when I was doing my my degree, and they wanted to go down the recording route, and then they would rent these units or do like 24-month rentals on these units, and they would just lie dormant for a while. So that kind of put me off a bit as well.
Totally.
This is around the time of like. You can do so much at home. Obviously, if you want to record a drum kit, you need to go to a studio, right? But yeah, that's another thing that put me off the whole recording, actually being a recording engineer side of things.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, digital mastering, like to get into that is very affordable. I mean, it all depends on how far you want to scale it, right? If you want to get like crazy with your monitors, obviously that can get really expensive. Even, you know, I don't think that there's a single piece of high quality mastering outboard gear that is affordable. You know, like I was recently looking into like an outboard EQ, and it's like they start at like $3,000-$4,000 to get something decent. You know, it's crazy. But yeah, when you're in the digital world, it's a different story. That's awesome. So all that said, now that we've talked about how mastering was this dark art, let's talk about the dark art of your mastering process. You know? So I'd love to know, like, when it comes to starting a new project and mastering a project for an artist, like, where do you typically start? Like, what's your normal process like there?
So my normal process is, so when I'm working with a client, there's a lot of back and forth to begin with. I say a lot. It depends on the mix itself. So I generally provide feedback to the client, the artist, on their mix, and say, okay, well, this is great. Tell me where you want to go. Send me a reference. References are so important. I cannot stress that enough. Like if you've, and also while I stress the importance of a reference, it's important for artists to provide a reference that is relative to what it is they're trying to achieve. Because I don't know about you, but I've had that previously where they submit a reference with the track, and I'm like, that's not in the same ballpark as to your song. You maybe want to go, you got to be diplomatic, right? You maybe want to go back and rethink what your reference is. So slight tangent there, but importance of referencing and getting the appropriate
100% agree with
reference.
you on that one. I get that all the time where it's like, you might get like this punk band and they're like, here's this Led Zeppelin song we like as our reference. It's like, these don't sound anything alike,
Yeah. In the synth realm, it might be something along the lines of they said, I've got this track and it's synthwave, and they send me like this D&B dark wave track, and I'm like, it's not quite the same, but yeah. So that's pivotal. So there'll be back and forth there, and it'll also be things like I'll look at the sort of the crest factor as well. So you're looking at the integrated loudness, the short-term loudness, and the RMS and things like that. And getting quite scientific and granular with the mix that they've sent me, and saying, okay, well, at the moment you've got this going on. If you were to just address maybe some issues in the low end. That low end is quite prominent. I think when it comes to feedback, a lot of it is in the low end and probably around sort of like 3K, where there's a lot of information going on and where we are naturally sort of drawn to that particular frequency range around those presence frequencies. But in the low end in particular, and I think that stems from a combination of things, rooms, and also the way they're listening to their music as well. And there are ways you can get around that with things like tonal balance, for example, and match EQ. But so yeah, I'll feed back to them and say, okay, well, if you make these tweaks, then this will make the mastering process. There's less for me to do in the mastering. Not that I want to do less, because providing the feedback is inherently doing more, right? So then they submit the mix to me, and then the way I like to set up a session is I'll import the mix into a session. I've got a whole template set up for this as well. I think there's a video actually on my YouTube channel if anybody wants to go and have a look. Well, there might be one coming soon. I can't remember. But then I'll go in and I'll set it up. So once again, I'm quite scientific with my approach. So I'll look at the true peak. So I'll find the true peak of the track. I use RX audio for doing this. And I'll make a note of where that is in the mix in the mastering session that I'm working on. And then I'll also make a note of the short-term LUFS as well to work out where that is and get that information from RX audio, stick that in. And then I like to set it. So I'll look, say if the true peak of the mix is sat around minus 7.8. Then I'll use clip gain I use Reaper for mastering. I'll use clip gain to get it up to 6. I like to get it to a nice even number. And that's how I set up a mastering session. So I'll have the actual master on one track, and then that feeds into sort of another track, which is the one where I print the master on as well. And that's got a particular naming convention. And then I do also have parallel compression set up for like loudness compression and also macro dynamic compression as well. And that's generally how it's set up. So there's a lot that goes on even before I listen to the actual master itself in the context of me mastering. So there's that feedback. And they're setting up the session with the true peak, short-term LUFS, getting it set up in the DAW correctly, and going from there, basically. And then it's straight into listening. So I listen to the master itself. This could sound weird. I don't know if anybody else does this, but I sit there, eyes closed, or I say eyes closed. I'm looking down, basically, and making notes as I am listening. So I'm listening to things like the low end, stereo width, high end, and in particular, how the low frequencies and the low mids are supporting the high mids and mid range as well. Once again, going back to what I said earlier about sub 100 hertz is a lot of the time where you get some problems with the particular sort of mixes and artists that I'm sort of working with, these independent artists who don't necessarily have the setup at home to be able to hear properly what's going on down there. And I think that's where it's important to have that feedback loop before the mastering process. So yeah, a long-winded answer, but that's basically how the session starts.
No, that's awesome. And I think that it's a good thing that you brought up that idea of like mixing low end, because it is something that a lot of people struggle with. And I see that all the time in the songs that I master as well. And, I think there are a lot of factors. It could be the room. I think sometimes it's inexperience, but I also think too that like a lot of people, like you said, they're mixing on speakers that maybe are too small. They just don't have the bass in them, and it makes it harder for them to gauge that. And because of that, people just avoid it, and hope that someone else is going to fix it. But I think it is important to not only listen to reference tracks, like you said, but also just to, like, when you're mixing, listen on systems that do have that low end. It doesn't need to be in your studio. Like, find your car, like listen to it in a car where there's a sub, or listen to it on like a home theater system, whatever. I think as long as you can find a couple different like if you're monitoring on systems that don't have that low end, like have a couple backup systems that are like your regular commercial audio stuff that once you understand how your studio translates to those, then I think you're in a safe zone, right? Where you can comfortably mix that low end and send it to a mastering engineer and feel pretty good about it. So yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I think it is important for people to focus on that low end, obviously.
100%, because you've got to think as well. For example, I've got these Adam Audio speakers that I've got here. I love Adam Audio stuff. And the range goes down to about, I think, 40 hertz or something like that. Now, if you've got no way of listening to what's going on below that, you could have this huge swell of energy going on down there. And particularly if you're creating a track for an EDM track or something like that, and that's going to be played out in a club or a loudspeaker system, if you haven't controlled that low end, when that gets played out, it's just going to be, and it's going to not overtake, but it's going to have an incredibly detrimental effect to the rest of the mix. And if you're not able to hear that, you're already sort of like, you're starting 2 steps back before you've even started. So that, once again, going back to, like you said, you need to find systems where you can listen to that low end. And also tools like tonal balance will help you with that. And it's a visual aid. And you can, the audience listening, you may be familiar with it. It's isotope. And you can see, and it'll show you, you got this, they've basically taken readings from certain genres of music and come up with this curve of tonal balance. And then it'll do the upper and lower, doing that with my hands, no one can see me, but upper and lower margins of where your tonal balance sits. And that's a really good tool to use. So if you really don't have access to those speaker systems where you can listen that low, then something like tonal balance can help. I don't know if there's I'm all about providing free alternatives for listeners, because not everybody wants to pay for these things, or has the money to do it. But I don't know if there's a free, and maybe somebody knows, they could reach out to us and let us know. I don't know. But,
yeah. No, but you're right. You're absolutely right. And I was going to mention that too, is like, even if like the worst case scenario, you don't have any other speakers you can listen to music on, there's at least like visual tools that you can use to kind of get a better sense of it. And like you said, tonal balance is a great one. There's another one that is free, Voxengo Span. It's like a metering tool, metering plugin, and that's totally free, and it gives you like the visualization of what the frequency response is like. So compare your music against another song on there, and you'll get a sense of how much low end you have. And if you see that you've got a ton in like the sub range or something like that, then maybe you got to clean that up a little bit. So like there are lots of different visualizers that will allow you to at least get closer in the right ballpark. So, I think it's important for people to use those too. And it's not that you always want to be mixing with your eyes, but like sometimes those things can help you when your ears don't have the ability to.
Exactly. You got to know where your limitations are. And if your limitations are that you cannot physically listen to anything below that frequency, then you've got to move. You got to pivot and use your eyes. It's much like anything, isn't it? If you're an artist or a musician, you're not very good at mixing, what are you going to do? You're going to outsource it, or you're going to put the time in and get better, But I'm glad you mentioned Voxengo Span, because I actually signposted that to someone earlier in the week with regards to phase correlation. And that's another one I see a lot as well in mixes that are submitted. And I think that's when you need to go back and look at the instrument groups that you have. I mean, that's a whole different conversation in itself with regards to phase correlation. But I often see issues with phase correlation in mixes as well. And it's okay to have it every now and again, but when it's constantly in that sort of minus, it's dropping below 0, then you've got some issues there. I don't know how often you sort of see that in mixes that are sent your way.
Yeah. Like I definitely see phase issues all the time, especially when it comes to things like drums. Like people just, they don't pay attention to it when they're miking up stuff, and all of a sudden they're adding a ton of EQ trying to make up for these mistakes that are just like really just a matter of pressing a polarity invert button, and then all of a sudden it's fixed and you're good to go. So phase is definitely an important thing there. I want to go back into your process a little bit more. So you talked about how one of your first steps is just like adding gain, or at least like setting up your session so that your tracks are at a certain level. And what's your reasoning behind that? Is it just because that's your output level that you're trying to shoot for? Is like, I think you said minus 6. Is that minus 6 LUFS or?
No. So that's minus 6. So in terms of true peak level. So what I'll do is in Reaper, I'll have a marker for where the true peak is. So I'll import the audio into the session. and then pick out where the true peak is. So if it's, like I say, minus 7.9, I find out where it is. Then I use clip gain in Reaper to get up to 6. The only reason I do that is so I got a nice even number to use throughout. Because what I do is throughout the whole process, whenever I do any processing, I start with EQ, some subtractive EQ if I need to get rid of some low-end rumble or any resonant frequencies or something along those lines. Every time I'm using a different tool, I will check and I'll go in and look at the true peak and also look at the short-term LUFS as well, and just gain match throughout the whole process. And it's something that a mastering engineer introduced me to a couple of years ago, and it's not something that I ever used to do. I still do it by ear. I get it close by ear, but sometimes it's like 0.2, 0.3, and I mean, quite hard to hear sometimes when it gets down to that sort of 0.1, 0.2. But I try and keep it as even as possible. And it comes down to gain staging. So I want to make sure that the signal going into the next chain in the the next chain in the signal flow is at the optimum level that I want it to be. So that's why I do it. Setting it at 6, setting that true peak at 6 by using that clip gain just means I've got a nice even round number that I can work from. And then I know, okay, so I'm going to do my EQ. Then I'll bring in a unison compressor, for example. And then I'll go and look at the true peak and I'll look at the short-term LUFS and get it back to around about where it was before I did any processing. Then if I keep doing that all the way down the line, then I know when it comes to actually using a clipper, for example, just before it hits the limiter, I know, okay, well, it's going to be around minus 6. I look in true peak and I look at the true peak using Insight and I can see, okay, well, it's minus 5.9, minus 8, and I can get it back up. And then it's quite a scientific way of doing it, but I find it gives me the cleanest, and it also gives me the best potential for loudness, perceived loudness as well. That's what it all comes down to for me. It's all about that level, and it's about tonal balance ultimately in mastering, really.
Gotcha.
So that's my rationale behind it.
For sure. And I imagine too, like when you're using those same numbers consistently through each plugin in the chain, like it's also helping to make sure that you're not getting fooled by loudness either, because that's another big thing I see a lot of people do when it comes to mastering is like, you just add a bunch of EQ and all of a sudden the mix is louder, so you think it sounds better, but is it really better? You should always be like comparing to at the similar levels, right?
100%. And also another point of that is as well is I always have the mix, what I call compare track down the bottom. So having done all that gain staging, for whatever better way of putting it, throughout the process, I know I can flick between, I can just solo the compare mix, and I know it's going to be at the approximately same level. So any changes I've made to my mastered mix, I know I'm not going to be fooled by loudness, like you mentioned there, basically.
Yeah, for sure. And this all applies to mixing as well, too. Like anyone who's not mastering, like if you're adding EQ or compression to your tracks in a mix, like you still want to make sure that you're not getting fooled by that loudness, and you should always be trying to make sure that you're matching the input and the output levels on all your plugins. There are a couple other great tools out there that can help you throughout the process. Like I know Ian Shepherd has, I think it's called Perception, or Meter Plugs is his company there. And Perception basically allows you to you add one instance of it at the very beginning of your chain, one at the end of the chain, and it calculates the difference between where you started and where you ended, and then it automatically gain stages everything for you. So, things like that are really cool tools to just make sure that you're not getting fooled by loudness and that what you're doing is actually making the impact you think it is.
100%. And I think as well, I use Maximizer in Ozone for that final stage of the process. And it's got that gain match feature in it. So you can apply that that limiting. And by using gain match, once again, you're not going to get fooled by, specifically if you're at the start of your mastering journey, for let's say, or you're a DIY producer or musician, you're not going to get fooled by loudness. It's going to be at that level that you want it to be, but you're going to be able to hear, okay, well, the differences I've made, I can A/B against compare my reference mix, knowing that it's going to be at the same perceived level, but I can hear those subtle differences that I've made. Because as you mentioned, it's quite easy to get fooled by loudness. Totally,
yeah. And I even know a very popular DAW for mastering is Wavelab, and they just actually introduced the loudness matching in their latest version of the software too. So cool. It'll be cool to see. I think a lot more DAWs are going to start to implement that kind of thing because it's a pretty handy tool to have. So why not have it just built right into the DAW?
100%. I totally agree with that. And I need to look at Wavelab. I've been using Reaper now for mastering probably for about 8 years. And it was when so tangent here, there's a story behind this. I went and spent some time in a mastering studio in Mid Glamorgan in Wales. And the engineer there was using Reaper. And I just loved the workflow of it. And this was 10 10 years ago. And that's how I fell into Reaper. And I've just been with it ever since. But I do need to look at Wavelab. I speak to a lot of mastering engineers now, and it's something I need to look at. But I've just been in Reaper this whole time, which seems counterintuitive because I use Logic for when I'm mixing. So I'm flicking between DAWs, which probably doesn't help in me mastering one of them. Sort of like jack of all trades with DAWs.
I'm in the same boat. I used to, Pro Tools is like my wheelhouse. I know Pro Tools super well, but I used to master in Logic for some reason because I just felt more comfortable or faster in there with my workflow. And then a couple of years ago, I switched over to Wavelab, and it's definitely there's a big learning curve to it, but it's meant specifically for mastering. So in that sense, everything you need is all in one tool, which makes it really easy. So definitely something you should look into. It's pretty cool.
I know. I really should do. I should know these things, but I've been so like, oh, wow, it's just another DAW.
Yeah, I
was using tools when I was in the studio. I've used Ableton as well. The only one I haven't used is Cubase. I've even used Reason. I've tried it. Once again, I guess it goes back to what I was saying earlier. You try all these tools out and figure out the one that you want to use. But I did like tools. When I was recording bands, tools was good, man. But then when I went into like the electronic stuff, I was like, oh, man, I'm going to use Logic now.
Fair.
It's cheaper.
Cool. So yeah, we talked about that true peak and how you'll have that consistency throughout your whole chain. And then I'm assuming as far as like the output level goes, you mentioned you might use a clipper or you'll have a limiter on your chain, and that's presumably where your volume's largely coming from?
Yeah. That's correct, yeah. So the clipper, I do have a separate, I don't always use it. So when I'm controlling macro dynamics, I'll either do clip gain, for example, I'll chop and then do clip gain for particular sections for the macro dynamics. So changing, when we're going from like the intro to the verse to chorus, and just get a nice even flow throughout that, if it needs it. Or sometimes I'll use a loudness compressor, parallel compression, and I use a clipper on that as well, just to make it apparent. And I use standard clip, which is relatively cheap. It's a great clipper, but that's just to trim. It's just getting rid of those subtle peaks at the top there, and just to give me an extra bit of headroom when it comes into the actual final stage of the process, which is using the maximizer, which is using limiting, and getting it to that sort of competitive loudness level. And having gone through that process of being meticulous with the level from each chain, part of the chain, it means that when it comes to that clipper, I know approximately, okay, well, I could see my true peak here is at minus, as I mentioned earlier, 5.9. So I can just set the gain on the clipper to 5.9. Maybe just use the clipper just to shave off any peaks if they're still there, because inherently with the music that I'm working with these independent artists, there's a lot of kick and snare, and a lot of my feedback is your kick and your snare is quite powerful here. We could get a bit more loudness out of this if you maybe just control that a bit more. Sometimes they're like, nah, that's the final mix. I'm like, okay, well, I'll see what I can do. But that's where the clipper comes in. So it's just giving me that extra bit of headroom going into that final phase of using the maximizer to get it at that competitive level. And that's a whole nother conversation in itself, isn't it? It's like, what is the level? I don't shoot for a particular level. I go for what sounds good, what is conducive to that record, that song sounding the best it can. And if I get to that level, and whatever that level is, then I'll go with that level. And I've had that conversation a lot over the last few weeks, and I've been chatting to other mastering engineers on my podcast, Inside the Mix. And it's that classic, isn't it? You shouldn't be aiming for a level. You shouldn't be aiming for something. It should be a case of whatever sounds good, what is conducive to that sounding the best that it can sound.
Totally. Yeah. And I was curious to dive into that a little bit more with you as well, because I'm kind of in the same boat where I think that like there's that point of diminishing returns where like, you can only push a track up so much before you start to get into artifacts, and it starts, your limiting is too aggressive and all that kind of stuff. And especially with the digital platforms these days, normalizing everything, then like you don't have to worry about it as much, So you mentioned competitive loudness, and I think that that's an interesting way of putting it, and that is the challenge that I think we all face is that like there's often that that balance of what we know sounds best for the song versus what other people are maybe doing, and people are getting fooled by loudness. There's also like the artist's expectations of loudness and that kind of thing. So how do you balance that with your masters?
It's a really interesting one, that, because I was actually editing a podcast earlier today with another conversation with another mastering engineer and listening to it, and he said, if somebody approaches me and says, I want this mastered at -6, that's like an immediate red flag. for him. And I was like, actually, that does make sense. Like if someone comes to you and says, I need this to be at -6, you kind of like, well, you're not, I mean, that's a target. You're shooting for a target. Like you could just use gain and get it up to what it needs to be. So for me, it really depends on the music as well. Like you could have, because I've done this, I was mastering a track last weekend and it was this sort of quiet acoustic Italian singer. Oh, she's British, but she was singing in Italian. And obviously that's gonna, the competitive loudness, the loudness for me for that, it's not going to be as loud as an EDM track, right? It's not. When we know like EDM, dance or something like that, it's got to be at a competitive level to stand out. And when you play it back in a club, you don't want the DJ to play the song and then suddenly the volume drops. Yes, they can control it as well. I mean, they can boost it using their controlling platform. But ultimately, that's where references come in as well, come in really handy, and having suitable references. So if an artist says, I got this track and I want it to sound like this or be similar to this at this particular level, that gives you a good place to start. But it goes back to what I said earlier. For me, really, with synth music in particular, it's all down to like, okay, well, as mastering engineers, we're creative, right? That's the beauty of us versus assistant mastering. We can still make those creative decisions rather than just crunch numbers like an AI platform would do. And we can say, okay, well, this is what I think is best for your music. Sometimes I'll send it across. They're like, actually, Mark, it's still, I'd like a bit more. I'd like you to squeeze a bit more out of it, which is fine. But yeah, I don't know where, I mean, it's a bit of a roundabout way of saying it, but it really depends for me on the genre of the music. Like I say, you could have a classical piece and it could sit around somewhere like -13, -14 LUFS. And then I might do something that's sort of, like I said, that sort of dance EDM stuff, and you sort of sat around -7, -8, possibly. You never know. But when it comes to that, you are at the limitations of the mix. If you're sent a really, really good mix with great dynamic range, great tonal balance, you'll be able to get it at a pretty I'm saying it again. You'll be able to get it at a pretty good level, a pretty like that -6, -7, if you need it to be there. Once again, you don't want to shoot for that just because you shouldn't be shooting for a number, but you're at the limitation of your mix. Ultimately, if you're sent a mix that needs a bit of work, it's going to have an impact on that perceived loudness that you can get out of it. Because you could have something that's at like -14 LUFS, and if it's got great tonal balance and great dynamic range, it's still going to be perceived as loud, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think that a big part of the mastering process too is really understanding how the songs are going to be used. You know, like if it's just going to digital and that's it, fine. The normalization, like that'll get taken care of, right? But what's interesting is like in your world of synth-based stuff, it often like, it's not like a band that just like performs these songs live on stage. Like in your world, these people are actually taking these masters and playing the master across a club, you know? And so the volume thing does become a little bit more of an issue there because it's not just being used for people to like listen to at home. It's actually being used to feed through the club. And you know, often DJs are trading off sets and, you know, like you said, like you don't want the volume to just drop. So that is a factor. Exactly. Like you do have to be aware of where things are being used and, you know, taking that into consideration for how loud you're going to push things.
I think labels as well. Labels will have a desire for how they want it to be, depending once again on the style of the music. You could send them a master and they'd be like, no, it needs to be, I don't like to use the term, but it needs to be louder. You're like, well, okay, I'll squeeze a bit more out of it. But for me, I mainly master sort of like synth pop, synth wave, retro wave. So it's never, I don't think I've ever done one sort of like -6, -7. It's usually anywhere between sort of, it could be anywhere really. Like I said, I did one on the weekend, it's -13. It could go down to -9. Once again, it's all dependent on the style of the music. And like you mentioned there, the playback platform is really, really important. Where's it going to be played? But what I want to stress as well is to like listeners is you got to think beyond streaming platforms, because streaming platforms can change their algorithm. They could change it tomorrow if they wanted to. They could suddenly turn around and say, okay, we're not going to use LUFS as the standardization anymore. We're going to use something else. So all those people that have shot for that -14, your masters now, not that they're going to be redundant, but if they change the goalposts, then you've created a master that's specifically for that particular goalpost or goal, as it were. So kind of what I'm trying to get out there is you kind of want to create the best master you can that's conducive to the music. And also as well, I don't know about you, but I create one master to rule them all. I don't generally buy
same
into creating a master for each individual platform. Doesn't really make sense to me. I can do it. Don't get me wrong, but I think one master to rule them all generally works. There are subtle occasions where that might change, but yeah, that's my thought process.
Totally. And I think too, that largely depends on your clientele as well. And for most independent artists, they're just using something like a DistroKid or something like that, where one file is all you get. Most of these services don't really offer you the ability to have different masters for different platforms and
money as well, isn't it? I mean, it's going to cost you, if you want to upload a different master to each platform, it's going to cost you a fair bit of cash to do that.
Yeah. And hey, if you're super serious about your audio fidelity, then maybe you're willing to fork up that money. But I haven't come across an independent band that cares.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%. You got to think about where. I think that's where this is a discussion in itself. That's where AI comes into it. And because I was chatting to someone the other day about when should an artist think about using a mastering engineer versus assistant mastering? And it comes down to, okay, well, the answer was if you want something that's going to be legacy, if you want something that is going to be a legacy of yours musically, then you probably want to consider going down the professional mastering route. But if you want to just release something to build a following, to build a catalog quickly, then that's where the assistant mastering could come in. Things like Lander, like Cloud Bounce, or doing it yourself with Isotope, for example. So I can't remember how I got onto that topic, but I think it's when you're making that decision. Oh yeah, that was it. What the purpose is for the master or the music that you're creating. Are you trying to create something that's a legacy that you want to look back on and think, that's incredible stuff? I suppose you could do that with assistant mastering, but if you're looking to create a body of work quickly, maybe for sync or something along those lines, then that's where the assistant mastering could potentially come in.
But also, I mean, to play devil's advocate there, most human mastering engineers are pretty quick as well. Maybe it's not instantaneous.
That's true.
But you might you'll get a master back in a couple of days. And if you're really that desperate to put out a song by the end of the night and have it released, then okay, maybe that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah. That is true. That's true. I'm doing us mastering engineers a disservice there by saying we're slow and aloof with our process.
I mean, most mastering engineers are pretty quick because it doesn't take very long to master a song as opposed to a mix where maybe it's more time consuming and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is true. True.
I think it does often just come down to finances, and that's why a lot of people go with AI, or they want that immediately mastered song, but it's not really completely mastered. It's algorithms. That's it.
100%. Yeah. It's they're just passing data essentially, and then they're using a data set, and it's used if then or else statements saying if it's this then do that, if it's this then do that, and that's essentially what it's doing. That's once again probably doing the assistive mastering and those who put it together a disservice, but essentially that's what it's doing, and it's not listening to your music, it's just passing data.
And you just need to hope that your mix works with that algorithm to make it actually work.
That is a huge thing, because you can obviously with these platforms you can select the genre, and then you've got to make sure that what you've selected is right, because it comes down to with generative AI as well. It's only as good as the prompt you put in. So you need to make sure that what you're prompting it to do is correct. Otherwise, you might not syntactically, let's say, programming terminology, it's correct, but logically, it might not make sense. You've submitted something, you haven't prompted it correctly. So that's a key thing to be aware of, I think. But I think as time progresses and these large language models, big data, etc., and it gets more sophisticated, thus these platforms will get more sophisticated and be able to do more of it for us in terms of selecting and getting the genre of music and a more granular refinement, and they'll get even better at it, I think.
Totally. Yeah, I agree that it will get better, but I also think, too, that it's so generalized these days that, just even if you look at, the world of metal, for example, you could be a metal band and go to one of those sites and say, I'm a metal artist, and what is its basis of what metal should sound like? Is
100%.
metal new metal from the 2000s? Is it the current metal days? Does it sound like Pantera, where everything is all super mid-rangey? You know what I mean? So there's so many different algorithms it could use depending on the style of that, maybe the subgenre or whatever, the era of the music that you're working on. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of argument for why you should be using a human to actually take into consideration the needs of your music there.
Yeah, it's that creative element as well, isn't it? Because you're not going to have that feedback loop. So you could be thinking, actually, it's much like I said earlier about manipulating the macro dynamics and saying, okay, well, the chorus is going to come in here, so I'm going to give it a 0.5 dB boost, or I'm just going to open it up a bit more in the chorus just to, or the crescendo or the middle eight, and I'm just going to open it up with some width. You're not going to get that. You're not going to get that from mastering at the moment, from assistant mastering at the moment,
Totally. So speaking of genre-based mastering, obviously, like you said, like you work on a lot of synth-based music, and we've probably touched on some of this already, but what are some of the challenges specifically when it comes to mastering music that is synth-based? Like what other things are you having to deal with that maybe you don't find as commonly in other genres?
I think with synths in particular, and this comes down to like sonics and soundscapes, it's because I can't remember if I mentioned this off air or on the podcast or not, but with synths, you can make anything you want. That's the beauty of synthesizers, right? Synthesis, sound synthesis, and sampling. You can create any sound you want. And what I'm finding is sometimes you'll get sounds that are layered upon layered upon layered upon layered, and then it can get quite busy in certain sections, much around the mid-range. And then if you're trying to squeeze a vocal in there as well, you've got to carve space out for all this. And this comes down to mixing, kind of like mixing fundamentals, isn't it, really? Like, if you've got all these instruments in one frequency range, they can coexist, but you need to carve space out for those if you want the vocal to pop at this particular section, or the synths are going to come through here, and that's where you can be strategic with your panning, and also your automation of volume, and also the EQ movements that you make, and also the time-based processing that you use. So a lot of the time, it's around that mid-range, and there's a lot of synth information going on. And it can also be quite narrow as well. It seems to be one of two ways. It's either inherently quite narrow or extremely wide. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about phase. So you'll have all this stuff going on in the sides, and then not a great deal in the middle, or it's just a snare down the middle. The other one is in the low mids. And in particular with synth-based music, you get that pumping bass, that sort of sound, which you get in other genres as well. And having that supporting the mid-range with regards to synths as well, and getting that balance there, I find that's often one of the first places I'll look. And then this comes back to what I said earlier about that sort of sub 100 hertz and then the kick drum and that low frequency information, because if you cannot hear what's going on beyond 30 hertz, you could have this pumping bass line that's coming through, and then you've got this rumbling sort of kick drum happening underneath as well. And that could just be conducive to what that's going to do inherently is it's going to eat up your headroom. Ultimately, it's going to increase that RMS. It's going to eat up your headroom. So those are the two main areas. So it's sort of like below 100 hertz, and then all those synths jostling for position around that mid range.
Absolutely. Do you find yourself leaning into tools like multiband compression and stuff like that to take care of, maybe some of those higher range synths and controlling that kind of stuff?
Sometimes. I don't use a great deal of multiband compression, to be honest. I used to. I've sort of moved away from a lot of multiband compression now. Occasionally, yes. If I'm using multiband compression, it's usually sort of like one or two bands in the lows or that mid-range. The highs, cannot remember the last time I used multiband compression on the higher frequencies. But sometimes if it really needs some sort of like controlling around there, that's what it is essentially, isn't it? We're controlling that perceived volume in those dynamics and those ranges. So, but no, I mean, inherently, multiband compression, I don't use it a massive amount. Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I feel like when I first started, I used multiband because I felt like it was like making the songs move a lot more. But the more I do it, the more I feel like I just don't feel like I have as much control as I want with it. So I've kind of avoided it. What did somebody say to me? I think it was when I was doing my degree, and he said, we're controlling energy in the different frequency ranges. And I was like, oh, that's bang on. That's brilliant. So I'm going to use multiband compression now. I went and bought the Wave C6, and I was like, boom, I'm going to use this on everything. And then I was like, actually, I think I had this epiphany. I was just like, actually, I probably don't need this right now. And I was just shoehorning it in there. And much like yourself, I was like, actually, is it doing what I wanted to do? Or could I just are there other tools that could do it for me?
Yeah.
Something similar. Anyway.
So your signal chain's pretty straightforward then. It sounds like it's just like some gain, EQ, a little bit of compression, clipping, and limiting. Like, was that a fair assessment, or is there other tools in there as well?
That's sort of like the basics of it. And there are other bits and pieces in there as well. So a saturation, I like the Black Box. That's a pretty good saturation tool. Shadow Hills, I like that plugin as well. The Shadow Hills one, I cannot remember the last time I actually used the compressing element of it. I just like the sound of it.
Me too.
Because it's got that nickel, what is it? Nickel,
steel, and iron, I think.
Yeah. And I just love it. I love the sound of it. And so that, I often use that. And I use I was using a Pultec emulation, which was a free one up until recently, but I've started to use the UAD stuff and brought those in now. So I kind of move, it depends on the track. The basics, as you mentioned there, is like you got that EQ, compression, and some more EQ, which is like the additive EQ. That's the creative side of it. So you got that corrective EQ, compression, you got the additive EQ when I'm being creative, and then you got the clipper, the maximizer, some compression if I'm doing any parallel compression, some saturation if it needs it, stereo width as well. So I use the Good Hertz stereo width. That's one plugin that I really like. If I want to control stereo width, I also use the isotope imager as well. So it really depends. It really depends. I'm not limited. If I think I have a plugin and I want to create a particular sound, then I'll bring it in. But my template is, as you describe, it's that EQ, compression, EQ, clipper, maximizer, limiter. More often than not, some form of saturation in there and some stereo width.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty standard kind of setup. Yeah. Obviously, you don't need to use it all the time. You just kind of have it in there ready to go, and you can trust that process usually.
I think that's important. I think going back to what I mentioned earlier about with Ozone and plugins like that as well, is because you've got all these different elements in there, and it could get a bit overwhelming. I think if you're just starting out thinking, okay, well, I've got all these different features I need to use, like stabilizer, impact, and stuff. I must need to use them because they're there, and you probably don't. Don't overcomplicate it. Just do what makes it sound good. Don't feel like you need to put something in because you have it. I think I think that goes with mixing as well and recording. Like, just because you have something doesn't mean you necessarily have to use it.
Absolutely.
It could be detrimental.
It's something that I always think back to, like whenever I'm focusing on mixing or even mastering too. It's like I constantly remind myself that back in the day, like people were making amazing sounding tracks with very minimal gear, and like if they maybe had a console that had one EQ, maybe a compressor, you know what I mean? So it's like, there's no reason to like start getting crazy and adding like 5 different EQs and multi-compressors and like, all this stuff. Sometimes 100%. You just have to simplify. And when you just get really good at using that minimal setup, that's all that matters. It's you don't need all that other stuff.
You got like Glyn Johns, who was miking up drum kits with 3 microphones and things like that, man. And think of the records that was used on. And also, what I find interesting, it's a bit of a tangent in itself, is when we're trying to emulate the sounds of records, particularly in the retro wave side of things in synthwave, we're trying to emulate these sounds from the 80s. You're thinking, well, they never had this equipment. They had these like DX7 Prophets and Moogs and stuff, which I would love to have, don't get me wrong. But they didn't have access to all these plugins and stuff we had. They had these synthesizers and then drum machines, and then they had this outboard gear. They didn't have this wealth of what we have at our fingertips. So I think it's important to bear that in mind as well when we're thinking about, okay, we want to create a particular sound. You don't need to throw the kitchen sink at it.
Yeah, and be mindful of like what kind of tools did they actually use? Because just because you have modern tools that maybe do something more advanced, like doesn't mean that that's the way to go either. Like, kind of dialing it back, I think is a good way to think about it. So at the end of the day then for you, like, with all of this stuff here, how long do you find it typically takes you to finish a master?
It's a good question. I would say in between 1 to 2 hours. 1 to 2 hours. I never put a limit on it. And I don't know if you find this, but if, for example, I'm doing a master this week and it's an album master, but as soon as I've done one track, then a 2, 3, 4, 5, you get a feel for it, and then it gets quicker as you go down, as you go through that process with that artist's music. But generally between sort of like 1 to 2 hours. But it has been known to be longer. Depends on the master itself and how much. I don't want to use the term corrective work. Depends, but if there's a lot of corrective work that needs to go on before that hasn't been able to be done during the feedback process. But it could sometimes with mastering, you often find that you do minimal to it. Like all you're doing is just polishing. You've got that dirty window and you're just applying a clean rag to it and just polishing it. And sometimes there's a lot more that goes into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was working on a track last night where it was just like, it just needed some gain. That was it. It was a great mix. So why mess with it,
Yeah. It goes back to what we were saying just now, doesn't it? Just because you have those tools doesn't mean you have to use them. If it sounds good as it is, then just roll with it.
Totally. So then, like, At the end of the day, like what, in your opinion, ultimately makes a great mastered mix?
A great mastered mix is something that, for me, it comes down to the fundamentals of mastering, which is like level, tonal balance, but excitement. You want something. I saw somebody doing this earlier, and I was like, that makes perfect sense. As a mastering engineer, if I'm sat there and the music's playing and I'm moving to it at the same time, then if it's making me move, then it's going to make, I don't know, it might be blowing myself up here, but it's going to make other people move at the same time. And that's what you want. For me, it's got to be that it's got to be at that level. It's got to be the best conducive level for the music, that tonal balance and excitement as well. Excitement.
Absolutely.
That's for me. That's what makes a good or a great master.
Couldn't agree with you more there, man. Right on, man. Fantastic. Well, Mark, dude, this has been a lot of fun. It's been great to have you on my podcast instead of me being on yours.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
To flip the coin a little bit, because I believe on your podcast I talked about mastering as well. So it's fun to hear both sides of the coin here. But if people want to learn more about you, follow you online, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, the main place to go would be synthmusicmastering.com, and there you'll find out everything that I do. You'll also find the podcast as well. The podcast is available on all podcast platforms and YouTube, much like Master Your Mix. But the best place to go would be the website, and then you can find the podcast page, and then you can find you can pick your poison in terms of how you want to consume it. And that's basically where you'll find everything. And then you'll find links to my Instagram, TikTok. Oh, man, I don't use that. I've given up on that. But Instagram, if you want to follow me on Instagram, Marc Matthews Producer. It's Mark with a C. And there's also Inside the Mix podcast as well. But in general, just go to synthmusicmastering.com and you'll find everything there.
Awesome, man. I'll add those to the show notes as well.
I appreciate it.
So that was my interview with Marc Matthews, and it was great to learn more about his process with mastering tracks, specifically in the synth-based world. And I thought it was really cool to get into his process and learn more about how he likes to deal with things like gain staging and, that idea of volume matching all of your plugins so that you're not getting fooled by loudness, which I think is a really important thing that a lot of people fall victim to, where when you're mixing, maybe you're adding some EQ or compression or whatever, and it's making your track sound slightly louder. And we always assume that louder equals better. And quite often we can get fooled into thinking that the moves that we've made are actually enhancing our tracks, when really they may actually be working against you. It's just that the loudness is fooling you. So, I think it's really important to focus on volume matching and gain staging properly throughout your tracks as you mix and as you master. So I thought it was really great to learn more about his process with that. And I also thought it was a great idea to get into the topic of tools that you can use when you're not feeling quite sure with your mixes. If you're not sure if you have enough low end or if you're in the right ballpark frequency-wise, I like that we talked about some various tools that you might want to use in order to be able to help you feel a lot more confident in what you're truly hearing inside of your mix. So I thought this was a great episode. I hope that you enjoyed it too. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And also, if you're currently working on tracks and you're not quite feeling sure if your songs are sounding the best way possible, maybe you've even used some of the tools that we've talked about here, but you're still doubting the quality of them. And maybe you're not sure, should you be doing more with EQ or compression, or is there just something else that you're not even thinking about that is wrong with your tracks? Well, if you want one-on-one help and feedback on your tracks and actionable steps to take to get your songs to that next level and to feel confident and proud of the music that you're making, if you're looking for one-on-one help with that is exactly what I can help you out with inside of my coaching program, Amplitude. And inside of that program, I work with you on your tracks, covering everything from the recording, editing, and mixing stage. You get a beginning to end system for creating pro quality tracks from your home studio. Plus, it's not just about learning the process, it's about actually implementing it and then getting feedback to make sure that you're executing everything properly. And if there are any struggles or challenges that you're facing, through the one-on-one coaching that we have, you get that feedback, you get that advice to make sure that you're not getting stuck and to make sure that you're actually getting the results that you truly want. So if you're interested in learning more about this program, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and that's where you can find all the details on there. And then on that page, you can sign up for a free demo call, which is where I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about your process, your goals, your current challenges, to see how I might be able to help you. And if it seems like this program is a good fit, then I'd love to talk more about the program, what it's like to work inside, and I'll show you around and give you a good demo of that. So if you're interested in learning more, once again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. Talk soon. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast.
To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.